Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson and the capstone of another book we've done in the entirety. We made it through the book of Lamentations. We will have made it through at the end of this lesson the book of Lamentations from start to finish. This is the capstone of that book, and just to review what we've already covered in greater detail, we've been dividing the chapters 1, 2, and 4, and 5 into 11 verses each for commentary, because the ones that come in the third chapter, which are 66 verses, they're a little shorter and more condensed, so we approach those 22 at a time. So we're going to cover the final 11 of the fifth chapter today, and we just want to review some of the themes and the highlights as we interpret them. You can take them or leave them. We welcome you to figure these things out for yourself, but here's what I think are the highlights and emphases of each chapter. Chapter 1 is the sorrow in Jerusalem. Jeremiah is the weeping prophet, and he is weeping at the sight and the spectacle of everything that he had warned would come to pass for 40 years had finally come to pass, and he would live in it and die in it, although he would be exiled to Egypt in the year 581. There he would die. Second chapter, we read about Yahweh's anger at sin, the rationale why he is righteous when he responds with retaliatory retribution. There comes a day when we can sin away the day of grace, and that's what Judah's situation was. Chapter 3 is hope in Yahweh's faithfulness. It is the longest chapter. It is 66. And all four chapters until the fifth one are arranged in order to poetic literary device known as acrostic. So there are 22 verses each in length, and that there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. They categorically exclude vowels. They are assumed but not written in their language. So the 22, each opening letter of the opening verse begins with a letter in the alphabetical order of the Hebrew language. And then, but it's not three acrostics, it's one. So they have one letter for three verses, all the way from Aleph to Tau, the A to Z in the English, and the Alpha and the Omega in the Greek. And then in the fourth chapter, we read of the satisfaction of Yahweh's wrath. Yahweh has completed his wrath, we read in the 11th verse. So what began in the second chapter was connected to the fourth, the satisfaction of his wrath. He is responding in wrathful retribution to a sin-soaked city, and had reduced it to ashes. But also in the fifth chapter, the theme we identify and are going to build on and establish as the foundation of this lesson, as we did before, is a prayer for restoration. It is 22 verses in length, although it is not arranged in an acrostic. There are poetic devices nonetheless, and this verse structure is more or less similar in length to that which we read of in chapter 3, but we managed to stretch the other one out to a decent amount, so we have no choice but to do so with this one. And we just want to review, we began the previous lesson, this lesson's predecessor, by connecting it to the third chapter, and we did the same thing with the fourth and the second. Now we're just going to read what we already read and covered in greater detail. We're not going to cover every verse or in as much detail as we already did. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, and our houses to foreigners. That was because they had sinned. This was the consequence of the covenant. The covenant was a two-way street. Blessings for obedience. They could dwell in the land of milk and honey, have their own land to call their own law, their own people, their own culture, and their own independence. But they had sinned away the day where they had could be reserved the right to exercise such freedom, largely because they had succumbed to the idolatrous influence of the foreigners around them. But these specific foreigners were Babylonians. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows because they had sinned. They had estranged themselves from their heavenly Father. And when one does that, there's a disintegration of the family, which we are literally witnessing in the United States of America as we live right now. So in simultaneous proportion to the distance we have erected between ourselves and our Maker has come the disintegration of the institutional traditional family as it has been known. The divorce rates is off the charts. The family is being redefined, and to accommodate people who, objectively speaking, engage in abnormal activity. Verse 4, we had to pay for our drinking water, and our wood came at a price. That's because the land is no longer yours. You have foreign landlords who took what you built and you created and you lived in and you dwelled in, and now it is theirs. So you have to pay for the privilege to drink the water you formerly drank for free, and the wood you could use to chop in your own backyard or wherever you got it from is now inflated at a price. We have labored and had no rest. So the rest is a big feature of the Jewish religion. Their day, the Sabbath, is a day of rest, but under foreign oppressors, the whole reason that they had a Sabbath was as slaves in Egypt, they did not have a day of rest. And it also commemorates creation. To Egypt we never had given a hand, to Assyria to be satisfied with bread. This is the temptation to rely on pagan powers at the expense of Yahweh. This is the frequent back and forth dialogue between the secular kings and the anointed prophets. They would tell them to not place their faith in either pagan Gentile power, but to have it in Yahweh. So alliances were a form of entangling idolatry. Our fathers sinned, they are no more. We have borne their witnesses. One of the things we say for the end of the lesson is 7 living lessons that we reduce, because this is a capstone lesson from the book of Lamentations, the final of which is when parents sin, children suffer. We see these illegal children crying illegal children being escorted to and fro certain places, and they're suffering because their parents sinned in breaking over our border. They are lawless people, and by definition sinners, and their children are suffering from them. And if an illegal alien is separated from if an American breaks the law in accordance to the law, he is separated from their child. Why should it be any different from the illegal alien? So parents sin, children suffer. That's just the way it works. So our skin has become as hot as an oven, verse 10, because of the burning heat of the famine of food. So their skin is sun-soaked and just useless, and they are uncomfortable in the heat of the desert, the burning heat of famine for food. So he describes it to pangs, which are preferable. The sword is preferable to the pangs of hunger, as Jeremiah elsewhere describes. This is a literal famine-induced city. The mothers are eating their children for want of food. And they have humbled the women in Zion, the maidens of the city of Judah. So they had been humbled because they were humiliated. This is what it took. And one of the reasons we read most of the verses out loud is they established the narrative flow. So we're going to start the actual lesson itself. This is the second longest preamble. I did one all the way up to 9 minutes, but we're going to get started right ahead. Rulers were hung up by their hands, and the elders were not respected. So rulers would have been royalty, and they would have been killed, and as an added humiliation to being killed, they would have been hung up by their hands as a trophy and a display for the Babylonian people to laugh at, to gawk at, to gather around, and glory in their own might, and just be sore winners, kicking a man while he is down. And, there's no respect for the elders in community. This is a community in collapse, a covenant community which had forsaken the covenant long before the covenant maker had forsaken them to a foreign land. One of the terms of the covenant was respect for elders, and that is the central commandment of the Decalogue, the 5th one, the one which marks the transition from the sacred ones, which govern our relationship to divinity, and our righteous ones, which govern our conduct and behavior with men. They have taken young men to grind, and the youth stumbled under wood. So these youth are subjected to back-breaking oppression. They're stumbling under the weight of the wood they're being forced to carry about. They are being reduced to beast of burden by cruel taskmasters who are their conquerors, and as such they reserve the right to control their life and determine their destiny, and they see nothing better than to turn a conquered people into physical slaves, because why else would you even conquer a people in the ancient world? That was one of the consequences of being militarily victorious. You were able to do with the people you had conquered whatever you deemed fit. Elders have ceased from the gates, young men from their song. So there's no song to sing. There is such a thing as a song in the night. I believe we read of it somewhere in Job. And we witness an example of that in Paul and Silas in the 16th chapter of Acts. They are singing a song in the night whilst in prison in Philippi, and the walls come crumbling down and they escape, and then they eventually get their way out, and Paul makes it known that he is a Roman citizen, so what they had done to him was just illegal, and they would have to answer for it. But that's another story. But no matter how dark the hour, we should always find at least some room on the tip of the tongue for the song of praise. Instead of complaining about all the things we lack and don't have, why not give thanks and praise for everything we do have? And this will reduce the bare necessities to our daily bread. And we don't really have the right or reason to ask anything more than our daily bread, at least in the strict parameters of the Lord's Prayer. But I feel I'm deviating too far into the New Testament. In the Old, this is an Old Testament text and should be approached and treated as such. The joy of our heart has ceased. Our dancing has turned into mourning. So if there's no singing, there's no dancing. And what once they had reason to dance because they were joy, but the joy in their heart was permanently and rudely interrupted, and to be no more. There was no more joy in their heart. A heart is able to experience the full spectrum of human emotion. That means joy and pain and sadness and sorrow. And Jeremiah torn a lead on the laconic, the lamentation-prone prophet. So he is the weeping prophet, and he identified with the misery of his people. And what's significant here is also the tense of the pronoun, the use of the pronoun. So he assumes he's engaged in an intercessory prayer. He is confessing the sins of his nations, which he was largely innocent of, and he is assuming the consequences of that confession. So this is not a selfish prayer. He is speaking of our heart. He has a mind of the collective, and everyone around him, everyone he's living with, is not dancing because they have no joy in their heart. There's no reason to sing and dance when mothers are eating their children and comparing unfavorably to jackals, of whom we're going to read of eventually, and that the jackals, even the most unlikable of wild animals, care for their young, whilst the women of Jerusalem do not have that luxury, and therefore favor uncomparably to the lowest of beasts, the most certainly the least beloved. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. Now the crown, they no longer had a king on their throne. Zedekiah was escorted, and according, I believe, his children were killed before his very eyes, and he had his eyes physically gouged out, thus vividly fulfilling a prophet of Ezekiel that he would go to the land but not see it. But the consequence of no longer having a king is no longer having a national identity. They were a monarchy, and so when there was no longer a monarch on the throne, that meant they were someone else's subject. And this was the result, once more, same thing as we summarized most of the ones we commented on earlier. It was because they sinned. So it was because they had sinned. For we have sinned, woe to us, we deserve it. We do not deserve to have our own king. He is acknowledging the righteousness and the rationale of why Judah is in this present predicament. They had no one to blame but themselves, and he identifies with the sins of the nation, which he was largely not complicit or condoning or indulging in the sins of. Because of this, our heart has been sick. Because of this, our eyes have become dim. So there's a inner sickness, the heart has become sick, and there's a physical deficiency. Their eyes have become dim. So there's plenty around them. They are surrounded and enraptured in darkness with the only light, their faith, their hope in deliverance and in Yahweh's ultimate plan of salvation. That is literally all they have left at this point. So their heart is, of course, going to be sick. They're living in devastation and ruin. What was once a resplendent jewel was now a ghost town reduced to ashes and rubble. What was once a flourishing city was now a shameful spectacle that no person would want to live in, especially them. Because of Mount Zion, which is laid waste, foxes have gone roaming in it. That's where in other translations, it's translated as jackals, but I actually did a word study, and I realized that this word also can be translated as that, foxes and jackals. So not quite the same thing, but close category. But it's because Mount Zion, that was the site, the foundation of the Temple of Jerusalem. It was the most sacred site in all of Jerusalem. The beautiful temple, it was no more. It was forgotten rubble and ruin. All that was left was the memory on it. And as a testament to its utter devastation and ruin, foxes were doing their business and going through it and treating it like there was their own. Of course, if there was a fully flourishing temple, foxes would not be walking across it and walking over it or in it. But that is the condition and the consequence of it being laid waste and ruined and destroyed, and irrecoverably so. You, O Yahweh, remain forever, your throne from generation to generation. So he finally stops talking about them and turns to him, the one to whom he offers his prayer to. And our prayers ought to begin and end and also be animated through by the one. They should be offered to the name of the Father in the name of, or offered to the Father in the name of the Son through the power of the Spirit. So whenever all the sin and all the suffering around you is surrounding you and overwhelming you, just look upstairs, look to the eternal, know that this, whatever is bothering you at the present moment, this too shall pass. We have hope and an anchor and an eternal source of solace and refuge and at all, etc. And his throne lasts forever, so they had lost their throne. The Davidic dynasty, which was promised a dynasty in perpetuity, which would be literally fulfilled by the Messiah, who reigns at the right hand of the Father in heaven right now. But for all intents and purpose, the Davidic dynasty in Judah, as it once was, would be no more. This marked the end of an era, the passing of an age, a revolutionary transition in their governmental structure. Why do you forget us forever? Forsake us for the length of days. So he's asking a question which is doubtful on the surface, but before we get all self-righteous in assessing the contents of this prayer, we have to understand the context in which it's delivered. He is in a miserable condition. He's just described it in the previous 5 chapters. The city of Jerusalem is a shadow of its former self, forgotten. It was a flourishing metropolis where he had once preached for 40 years that what would come to pass he was now living in. And so he's saying, is this going to last forever? And of course, he also predicted that there would be a 70-year prophecy, and this prediction is referenced in the book of Daniel, which is a mention of a major prophet by another major prophet. So he's just asking this out loud for the sake of he's assuming the voice of Israel. Turn us back to you, O Yahweh, and let us turn back. Renew our days as of old. So it all begins, we all want to end up where it all begins. Everything in this life begins and revolves around the one who gave life. Life is more significant than the one who has it. It is all about the one who gave it. We need to turn to him in all our ways, repent, full-scale transformation from ourselves, from the sin, from the flesh, from the world, from Satan himself, back onto the source of all life, who has the power of redemption and renewal and recreation. He can make you born again, and so it all begins and ends in him. And what comes after this verse is not necessarily pleasant, so much so that the Jews in the synagogue did not become the standard place of worship until, and as a result and a consequence of the exile, they would often repeat the 21st verse, just because what we're going to read that comes ahead of us, spoiler alert, it's pretty unpleasant stuff, but it's honest and raw, and these were legitimate observations and questions. For have you completely rejected us? You have been wroth with us exceedingly. So the answer to has he completely rejected any of us is answered and settled for all time on the cross. There's always an avenue through the atonement to redemption and renewal, and we know what the Jews still don't. And there is a limit to his wrath. There is a reason for his wrath. But I earlier mentioned, so all this came to pass as a righteous response to unrighteousness, which proliferated in the covenant community, which was created for the purpose, and its very reason of existing, was to shine as a light and a beacon to the Gentiles, to bring them onto the worship of the Creator. The Jews largely failed in that task. But there are 7 living lessons I want to take away now that we're commenting on. We have nothing more to say on any of the verses of Lamentations, at least for this round. There are 7 living lessons, so these are lessons we can live with and profit from. And the first one is, with privileges comes responsibility, and what naturally and logically follows is accountability. So the Jews were privileged to have this land of milk and honey. We Christians are privileged to have the new covenant laid out before us and explained, but we also have the responsibility. With greater revelation comes responsibility, and accountability is always connected to responsibility. So privilege, now lesson 2, blessings that are, and privileges that are taken for granted or used selfishly, they will be and can and must be taken from you. To enjoy the gifts but to ignore the giver is a species of idolatry. So he makes his light to shine and rain to pour on the just and the unjust alike, Matthew 5:45. But the just alone is grateful for the giver, where the unjust is at best grateful for the gifts. Yahweh is long-suffering, lesson 3, but must intervene with judgment. There comes an hour when you have sinned away your day of grace, and he is long-suffering, and he tolerates a lot of our nonsense, and he doesn't respond in wrath, and some of the sins of America are every bit as bad as some of these ancient centers of iniquity, and I'm convinced that if there wasn't a righteous remnant left, we would be suffering the same fate as Jerusalem. Yahweh is faithful to his covenant if he tells you in it that he will bless you as a consequence and response, and in response and as a result of your obedience, and he will discipline you and chasten you and in response and as a consequence of your disobedience. They are living in the fulfillment of the negative end of that two-sided coin. They had kind of basked in the other side. They were blessed with the land to call their own, a land of milk and honey, but it got taken away from them because they had sinned away their day of grace. Lesson 5, spiritual leaders, their disobedience trickles down into sin-induced judgment. So much rises, falls, and revolves around spiritual leaderships, and Jeremiah has harsh words to say about some of the priests and some of the false prophets and this, whose own disobedience set the example which was instilled in instruction, which is ignorant of the law that they were entrusted to uphold, keep, and honor, and pass on and explain, because they were sinful. They were living a sinful example, leading a sinful life. The people they influenced were sin, and because the society was sinful, it was deemed fit for judgment. Lesson 6, words can be preached without change of hearts. So Jeremiah was not an effective evangelist as measured by the standards of the world. He preached for 40 years up and down Jerusalem, and very few people listened to him. Very few people liked him. It is a well-established fact, established in Scripture and confirmed by history, that he who exposes and denounces the evil is less liked and less popular than the evil they denounce. This is with a price he paid for being a prophet amongst a truly, truly sinful people. They were in love with sin. They were lost in loving it. They couldn't care about this message of doom from this strange man who was telling them a message of gravity, which they neglected to take seriously. But the fault was not in Jeremiah. It was the fault in the audience. The ministry of conversion is not ours. It is wholly a divine work. It is the ministry of the Spirit in Him alone. And finally, lesson 7, parents sin, children suffer. So there was a righteous remnant. Jeremiah was one of the ones who was living for Yahweh, who had to suffer because of the society-wide sin. And children, they were innocent. Now, they were culturally oriented to be educated by sinful parents, but they still had to suffer. And I think I elaborated as long as need be on our contemporary analogy, those being the illegal children who the mainstream media amplifies their victimhood because they're trying to bring us into a globalist state, a one world government in which the Messiah will rise and rule and unleash his tribulation. So we need to know the enemy and the times we live and prepare for a judgment which is not yet to come. So this judgment of Jeremiah is actually small potatoes for the judgment which awaits us. That's the day of Yahweh and the second coming. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.